Sometimes the strongest foundations crumble when you remove just one brick. Sarah Martinez had no idea that her dismissal from the elite crisis response unit would trigger a cascade of events that would expose years of corruption, destroy careers, and ultimately prove that she was the very person they desperately needed to keep.
What started as office politics and personal vendettas soon spiraled into a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved. The team that thought they could silence her discovered too late that some people refused to stay quiet, and some truths refused to stay buried. This is the story of how one woman's refusal to accept injustice brought down an entire corrupt system, and how those who tried to destroy her ended up destroying themselves instead. Sarah Martinez stood in the sterile conference room, her hands steady despite the tremor of rage building in her chest. Across the polished oak table sat three people who had once been her colleagues, now looking at her with expressions ranging from manufactured concern to barely concealed satisfaction. "We've made our decision," said Director James Harrison, his voice carrying the weight of someone who believed his authority was unquestionable. "Your recent performance issues and inability to work as part of the team have left us with no choice but to terminate your position with the Crisis Response Unit." Sarah's 15-year career with the Federal Emergency Response Team had been exemplary until 6 months ago. She had led successful operations during natural disasters, coordinated international relief efforts, and saved countless lives. Her personnel file was thick with commendations and letters of gratitude from communities she had helped rebuild after catastrophe struck. The performance issues Harrison referenced were nothing more than Sarah's refusal to sign off on inflated contractor bills and her insistence on investigating suspicious patterns in supply chain management. She had discovered that certain relief supplies were being diverted to private warehouses instead of disaster zones, but every time she tried to report it, her concerns were dismissed or buried in bureaucratic procedures. "I'd like to see the specific documentation of these performance issues," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. She had learned long ago that staying composed was often the most powerful weapon against those who expected emotional outbursts. Deputy Director Lisa Chen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Chen had been Sarah's closest friend on the team until recently, when she had suddenly grown distant and begun avoiding Sarah's calls. "The documentation is confidential personnel matter," Chen said without meeting Sarah's eyes. The third person at the table, Human Resources Manager Robert Kellerman, cleared his throat.
"The decision is final, Ms. Martinez. We'll need your badge and access cards immediately." Sarah had expected this moment for weeks. The writing had been on the wall ever since she had started asking uncomfortable questions about missing supplies and questioning why certain contractors always seemed to win bids despite higher prices and questionable track records. She had documented everything, copied files, and prepared for exactly this scenario. "Of course," she said, pulling her badge from the chain around her neck. As she placed it on the table, she noticed Harrison's slight smile of satisfaction. "I assume I'll receive copies of all documentation related to my termination within the required time frame? Your final paycheck and benefits information will be mailed to your home address." Kellerman replied quickly, clearly wanting to end the meeting. Sarah gathered her personal items from her desk while security watched. Her colleagues avoided eye contact, some genuinely uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, others clearly relieved to see her go. She had been the conscience of the unit, the one who asked difficult questions and refused to look the other way when things didn't add up. As she packed her family photos and the small succulent plant her daughter had given her, Sarah's mind was already working through her next moves. She had spent months preparing for this possibility, quietly gathering evidence and building a case that she hoped she would never need to use. The Crisis Response Unit had been her life's work. She had joined straight out of college, motivated by a desire to help people in their darkest moments. Over the years, she had seen the best and worst of human nature, had worked alongside heroes and witnessed incredible acts of selflessness. But she had also watched as the unit gradually changed, becoming more focused on politics and profit than on its core mission. The change had been subtle at first. New policies that seemed designed to create more paperwork than results. Contractor relationships that seemed too cozy, with the same companies always winning bids regardless of their proposals. Supply orders that never quite matched what arrived at disaster sites. Small discrepancies that individually might be explained away, but together painted a picture of systematic corruption. Sarah had tried to address these issues through proper channels. She had filed reports, requested audits, and attempted to discuss her concerns with supervisors. Each time she was told that the matters were being looked into, or that she was misunderstanding complex procurement processes, or that her concerns had been noted but determined to be unfounded. The breaking point had come 3 months earlier during the response to Hurricane Patricia, a Category 4 storm that had devastated coastal communities in Texas. Sarah had been on site coordinating relief efforts when she noticed that trucks carrying emergency supplies were being diverted away from the hardest-hit areas. When she investigated, she discovered that valuable medical supplies and water purification equipment were being rerouted to a private warehouse owned by one of their regular contractors. She had immediately contacted Harrison to report the diversion, assuming it was a mistake in the logistics chain. Instead of gratitude for catching the error, she was told to focus on her assigned duties and stop interfering with established procedures. When she pressed the issue, she was removed from field operations and reassigned to desk work, pending a review of her judgment and team cooperation skills. That review had apparently concluded with her termination. As Sarah walked to her car in the parking garage, she felt a mixture of sadness and determination. She was heartbroken to lose the job she loved, but she was also relieved that she no longer had to pretend not to see the corruption that was undermining the unit's mission. People's lives depended on their work, and the thought of disaster victims suffering while contractors padded their profits made her physically ill. She had copies of everything: invoices that didn't match delivery receipts, email communications showing preferential treatment for certain vendors, budget reports with unexplained discrepancies, and photographs of supplies being diverted from disaster zones. She had been careful to document everything legally, using only information that was part of her job responsibilities or publicly available. Her phone buzzed as she started her car. The text was from Marcus Webb, a junior analyst who had joined the team 2 years earlier. "I heard what happened. This is wrong. We need to talk." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Marcus had been one of the few people who had seemed genuinely troubled by some of the things they had witnessed together. He was young, idealistic, and reminded Sarah herself when she had first joined the unit. She typed back, "Not over the phone. Coffee tomorrow morning?" The response came quickly. Yes, the usual place. As Sarah drove home, she thought about her daughter Emma, a college sophomore studying journalism. Emma had inherited her mother's sense of justice and her refusal to accept easy answers. When Sarah told her about the problems at work, Emma had encouraged her to document everything and fight for what was right. Sometimes good people have to lose their jobs to save their souls, Emma had said, wise beyond her 20 years. Sarah's husband David had been more cautious. As a high school principal, he understood workplace politics and the dangers of challenging established systems. He supported Sarah completely but worried about the personal cost of taking on powerful people with resources and connections. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and spread out copies of all the evidence she had gathered. Invoice after invoice for supplies that were overpriced or never delivered. Email chains showing Harrison pressuring staff to approve questionable contracts. Budget reports with line items that made no sense. Photographs she had taken during disaster responses showing trucks being diverted and supplies being stored in unauthorized locations. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Over the past 3 years, the crisis response unit had been systematically defrauded of millions of dollars in funds meant for disaster relief. Supplies had been diverted, bills had been inflated, and emergency response had been compromised to benefit a network of contractors and officials who saw natural disasters as business opportunities. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her analysis. The caller ID showed her former colleague, Janet Rivers, a logistics coordinator who had worked with Sarah for over a decade. "Sarah, I just heard." Janet's voice was strained. "This is insane. You're the most dedicated person on the team." "It's okay, Janet. I saw this coming." "No, it's not okay. None of this is okay." Janet paused, and Sarah could hear the internal struggle in her silence. "There are things you should know. Things that are going to come out anyway." "What kind of things?" "Not over the phone." "Can we meet?" Sarah looked at the documents spread across her table. "Tomorrow afternoon." The park by the river. After hanging up, Sarah continued her review of the evidence. Each document told part of a larger story of systematic corruption that reached deep into the unit's operations. She had enough to make a strong case, but she needed to be strategic about how she presented it. Her laptop chimed with a new email. The sender was an address she didn't recognize, but the subject line made her heart race. "You're not the only one who knows." The message was brief. "Miss Martinez, I work for one of the contractors involved with your former unit. I have information you need to see. They think firing you will make this go away, but they're wrong. Some of us still have consciences. I'll contact you again soon." Sarah stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were others who had seen what she had seen, others who were troubled by what was happening. The unit's leadership had made a critical error in assuming that removing her would solve their problems. Over the next few days, Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from former colleagues.
Some offered support and sympathy. Others seemed to be fishing for information about her plans. A few were openly hostile, clearly viewing her as a traitor who had betrayed the team. Marcus Webb met her at the small coffee shop they had often visited during lunch breaks. He looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if he expected to be watched. "They're scared," he said without preamble. "Harrison called a team meeting yesterday and basically told everyone that you had been spreading false information and that anyone caught communicating with you would face disciplinary action." Sarah sipped her coffee, unsurprised by the attempt to isolate her. "What else did he say?" "That the unit's integrity was being questioned by outside parties and that we all needed to be vigilant about protecting sensitive information." Marcus leaned forward. "But here's the thing, Sarah. 3 more people have come to me privately saying they're uncomfortable with things they've seen. Your firing has people asking questions they weren't asking before." This was exactly what Sarah had hoped would happen. By making her termination so obviously retaliatory, Harrison had drawn attention to the very issues he was trying to hide. People who had been willing to look the other way were now starting to connect dots they had previously ignored. "Be careful, Marcus. Don't do anything that could jeopardize your career unless you're prepared for the consequences." "Some things are more important than careers," he replied, echoing her daughter's words. That afternoon, Sarah met Janet Rivers at the park. Janet looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. "I should have spoken up sooner," Janet said without preamble. "We all should have." She handed Sarah a manila envelope. "Invoices from the last 6 months. I've been tracking discrepancies between what we order and what actually arrives at disaster sites. The numbers don't add up, Sarah. We're talking about millions of dollars in supplies that are disappearing somewhere between our warehouses and the people who need them." Sarah opened the envelope and quickly scanned the documents. Janet had done meticulous work, cross-referencing purchase orders with delivery confirmations and inventory reports from disaster sites. The discrepancies were staggering. "Why now, Janet? Why are you coming forward now?" Janet was quiet for a long moment. "Because yesterday I got a call from my counterpart at FEMA asking why we claimed to have delivered medical supplies to a shelter in Louisiana that they never received. When I tried to track down what happened to those supplies, I was told it was none of my business and to stop asking questions." Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger. People could have died because those supplies didn't arrive. "That's what I keep thinking about. Every night. People suffering while someone makes money off their misery." Janet's voice cracked slightly. "I have kids, Sarah. How do I look at them knowing I stayed quiet about this?" Over the following week, Sarah was contacted by 6 more current and former employees of the unit. Each had a piece of the puzzle: suspicious contracts, mysterious budget line items, supply shipments that never reached their destinations, emergency responses that were delayed for no apparent reason. The anonymous emailer finally identified himself as Thomas Chen, a warehouse supervisor for Pinnacle Logistics, one of the unit's primary contractors. He agreed to meet Sarah at a restaurant across town, bringing with him a box of documents that made Sarah's evidence look incomplete by comparison.
"I've been keeping copies of everything for 2 years," Thomas explained.
"Every time they told us to reroute supplies, every time they asked us to falsify delivery confirmations, every time they paid us for services we didn't provide. My supervisor told me it was all legitimate, just complicated government procedures I didn't understand." The documents Thomas provided showed the other side of the corruption Sarah had uncovered. While the unit was inflating contracts and approving fraudulent invoices, the contractors were systematically stealing supplies and providing false documentation to cover their tracks. "Why are you coming forward now?" Sarah asked. "Because my daughter joined AmeriCorps last year. She's working disaster relief in Puerto Rico, and she keeps talking about how supplies never seem to arrive when they're supposed to. She doesn't know I work for one of the companies causing the problem, but every time she calls upset about not having enough medical supplies or clean water for families who lost everything." Thomas shook his head. "I can't do this anymore." As Sarah reviewed Thomas's documents that evening, the full scope of the corruption became clear. This wasn't just a few officials skimming money or contractors overcharging for services. This was a systematic conspiracy that was actively undermining disaster response and putting lives at risk. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma's number. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you told me about work. Have you considered going to the media?" Sarah had been thinking about exactly that. She had enough evidence to make a compelling case, and she had witnesses who were willing to speak on the record. But she also understood the risks. Going public would make her a target, and it would likely end any possibility of working in emergency management again. "I'm considering all my options, sweetheart."
"You know what you have to do, Mom."
"You've always taught me that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing." After hanging up, Sarah looked again at the evidence spread across her kitchen table. Photos of supplies being diverted. Invoices for equipment that never arrived at disaster sites. Email chains showing officials pressuring staff to approve questionable contracts. Financial records showing millions of dollars in fraudulent charges. She thought about the family she had helped over the years, people who had lost everything in hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. She remembered the gratitude in their eyes when relief supplies arrived, when medical care was provided, when temporary shelters were set up. She thought about how many people might have suffered or died because supplies were stolen or delayed for someone's profit. The decision was made before she fully realized it. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to Amanda Price, an investigative journalist known for her work exposing government corruption. In the subject line, she wrote, "Federal disaster relief funds being systematically stolen, lives at risk." As she attached the first batch of documents to the email, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. She was no longer carrying this burden alone. Tomorrow, she would start the process that would either vindicate her concerns or destroy her reputation completely. But tonight, for the first time in months, she would sleep knowing that she had chosen truth over comfort, justice over job security, and the welfare of disaster victims over her own career prospects. She hit send and closed the laptop. The real battle was about to begin. Amanda Price called Sarah at 7 a.m, just 3 hours after receiving the email with its explosive attachments.
The veteran investigative journalist had spent the early morning hours reviewing the documents, and her excitement was evident even through the phone.
This is bigger than you realize, Amanda said without preamble.
I've been investigating federal contracting fraud for 5 years, and this connects to patterns I've been seeing across multiple agencies. Can we meet today? By noon, Sarah was sitting in Amanda's cluttered office at the Washington Herald, surrounded by whiteboards covered with names, dates, and connecting lines that looked like a complex conspiracy theory. But Sarah's evidence provided missing pieces that suddenly made everything coherent. "Look at this," Amanda said, pointing to a network of contractor names. "Pinnacle Logistics, which your whistleblower works for, is a subsidiary of Meridian Group. Meridian also owns Rapid Response Solutions and Emergency Supply Specialists. All three companies have been getting no-bid contracts from your unit." Sarah studied the organizational chart Amanda had constructed. "So the same parent company is getting multiple contracts for the same disasters?" "They have contracts with FEMA, the Red Cross Coordination Office, and 3 state emergency agencies. If they're pulling the same tricks everywhere..." Amanda's calculator clicked rapidly. "We're talking about hundreds of millions in fraudulent charges across the entire emergency response system." The scope was staggering. What Sarah had thought was isolated corruption within her unit was apparently part of a much larger scheme that stretched across multiple agencies and states.
The companies weren't just stealing from one pot of money, they were systematically defrauding the entire emergency response infrastructure. Amanda's phone rang constantly as they worked. Other journalists, government sources, and whistleblowers who had heard rumors about her investigation were reaching out with additional information. By late afternoon, they had identified patterns of fraud and disaster responses going back 5 years. "We need to be strategic about this," Amanda warned. "The moment this story breaks, they're going to try to discredit you and anyone else who comes forward. They'll claim you are a disgruntled employee making false accusations, that your evidence is taken out of context, that you're trying to get revenge for being fired." Sarah had expected as much. "What do you need from me to make the story bulletproof?" "More sources, more documentation. And we need someone currently inside the system who can verify that the problems are ongoing." Amanda looked at her notes. "You mentioned several colleagues who were concerned about what they were seeing." Over the next week, Amanda and Sarah worked to build an airtight case. Marcus Webb agreed to speak on the record about the culture of intimidation that had developed within the unit. Janet Rivers provided additional financial documentation showing systematic discrepancies in supply accounting. Thomas Chen from Pinnacle Logistics offered to wear a wire to record conversations with his supervisors about future supply diversions. But it was the fourth whistleblower who provided the most damaging evidence. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan had been the unit's chief medical officer until she resigned 6 months before Sarah's termination. She had kept quiet about her reasons for leaving, but Amanda's inquiry prompted her to finally speak out. "I quit because I couldn't be part of what was happening anymore," Dr. Morgan explained during a recorded interview. "We were receiving reports from disaster zones that medical supplies weren't arriving, that emergency equipment was defective or incomplete, that response times were being delayed. When I tried to investigate these issues, I was told that my job was to coordinate medical response, not to question procurement procedures.
Dr. Morgan had documentation showing that medical emergencies had been prolonged because supplies were diverted or never delivered. In 3 cases, she believed that people had died as a direct result of missing or delayed medical equipment. During Hurricane Patricia, we were supposed to have portable dialysis machines at the evacuation center in Houston. Kidney patients were depending on those machines to stay alive while the hospitals were flooded.
The machines never arrived. We had to airlift 6 people to hospitals in Dallas at enormous cost and risk, and one of them died during transport.
Later, I found out that those dialysis machines were sitting in a Pinnacle Logistics warehouse in Oklahoma, supposedly due to a routing error. The human cost of the corruption was becoming clear, and it made Sarah physically ill. These weren't just numbers on spreadsheets or bureaucratic inefficiencies. Real people had suffered and died while others profited from their misery. As Amanda's investigation progressed, the pressure on Sarah intensified. Her phone rang at all hours with calls from blocked numbers. Cars began parking across from her house for hours at a time. Her email was hacked, and her credit report was accessed multiple times by unknown parties.
"They're trying to intimidate you," Amanda explained. "It means we're on the right track, but you need to be careful."
Document everything. Save copies of all your evidence in multiple locations. And consider staying somewhere else for a while. Sarah moved in with her sister temporarily, but the harassment escalated.
Someone broke into her house while she was at work, though nothing appeared to be stolen. Her car tires were slashed twice in 1 week.
A private investigator showed up at Emma's college asking questions about Sarah's mental health and financial situation. The message was clear: drop the investigation or face escalating consequences. Instead, the intimidation tactics backfired by providing Amanda with additional evidence of obstruction and witness tampering. Every incident was documented, photographed, and reported to authorities. The behavior was so obviously retaliatory that it actually strengthened Sarah's credibility. Meanwhile, cracks were beginning to appear within the crisis response unit itself. Marcus Webb reported that morale was plummeting as employees began questioning decisions they had previously accepted without thought. People were comparing notes about suspicious incidents they had witnessed, and the culture of willful blindness that had allowed the corruption to flourish was breaking down. Harrison called another all-hands meeting, Marcus told Sarah during one of their covert coffee meetings. He basically accused the entire staff of disloyalty and said that anyone caught talking to outsiders about internal matters would be terminated immediately. But instead of scaring people into silence, it just made everyone more suspicious. The breaking point came when Harrison attempted to fire Janet Rivers for performance issues, remarkably similar to those cited in Sarah's termination. But Janet had learned from Sarah's experience and was prepared for the attack. "I've been documenting everything since Sarah was fired," Janet told Amanda during a recorded interview. "Every suspicious contract, every supply discrepancy, every time I was told to stop asking questions. And I've been sharing that information with other employees who were having similar concerns."
Janet's attempted firing galvanized the remaining honest employees within the unit.
7 staff members submitted a joint letter to the Inspector General's office requesting a formal investigation into procurement irregularities and retaliatory management practices. The letter cited specific examples of supply diversions, inflated contracts, and efforts to silence employees who raised concerns. The Inspector General's investigation began quietly, but word of the inquiry leaked quickly through government channels. Within days, Amanda was receiving calls from congressional staffers, GAO investigators, and federal prosecutors who had been separately looking into related issues. "This is about to explode," Amanda warned Sarah. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Sarah thought about the families she had helped during her 15-year career, about the disaster victims who were counting on emergency responders to have their backs when everything else failed. She thought about Dr. Morgan's dialysis patients and the countless others who had suffered because supplies were stolen or delayed. "I've been ready since the day they fired me." The story broke on a Thursday morning with the headline, "Federal Disaster Relief System Systematically Defrauded. Lives Lost to Contractor Corruption." Amanda's article detailed the evidence Sarah and other whistleblowers had provided, connected it to broader patterns of fraud, and estimated that the scheme had diverted more than $200 million in emergency funds over 5 years. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, congressional leaders were calling for investigations, federal prosecutors were announcing criminal probes, and news outlets across the country were picking up the story. Sarah's phone rang constantly with interview requests, legal offers, and messages of support from emergency responders around the country, but the response from the Crisis Response Unit was predictably hostile. Harrison held a press conference denying all allegations and characterizing Sarah as a disgruntled former employee with a history of insubordination and conspiracy theories. He claimed that all contracts had been properly vetted and that any supply issues were due to the inherent complexities of disaster response rather than fraud. Martinez was terminated for cause after repeated instances of insubordination and failure to follow established procedures, Harrison stated. Her allegations are without merit and appear to be motivated by revenge, rather than genuine concern for the unit's operations. The attack on Sarah's character was comprehensive and vicious. Anonymous sources told reporters that she had been difficult to work with, that she had a history of making unfounded accusations, that she had been passed over for promotions due to poor performance. Her personal finances were scrutinized, her college transcripts were leaked to the media, and rumors were spread about her mental health and family life. But Amanda had anticipated the character assassination and was prepared with a counterattack. She had verified every aspect of Sarah's background, documented her exemplary performance record, and gathered testimonials from colleagues who attested to her professionalism and integrity. More importantly, the evidence spoke for itself. Documents didn't lie, financial records were objective, and the patterns of fraud were too clear and extensive to be dismissed as the fantasies of a disgruntled employee. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Letters poured in from disaster survivors who remembered Sarah's help during their darkest moments. Emergency responders from across the country shared their own stories of supplies that never arrived and bureaucratic obstacles that hindered relief efforts. Social media campaigns praised Sarah for her courage in speaking truth to power. Emma called from college, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I just saw the story on the news." "I'm so proud of you. This is exactly what journalism should be about. Holding powerful people accountable when they abuse their positions." David was more concerned about the personal cost. "I support you completely, but I'm worried about what this is going to mean for our family. These are powerful people with a lot to lose." His concerns were valid. The intimidation tactics escalated after the story broke. Sarah received death threats, her house was vandalized, and private investigators began following Emma at college. The stress was enormous, but Sarah drew strength from the support of her family and the knowledge that she was fighting for something bigger than herself. The congressional hearing was scheduled for the following month, but events moved faster than anyone expected. Thomas Chen, the Pinnacle Logistics whistleblower, was approached by FBI agents who were building a criminal case based on Amanda's reporting and the Inspector General's investigation. "They want me to wear a wire and record conversations with my supervisors about upcoming supply diversions," Thomas told Sarah during a tense meeting in a hotel room across town. "They're planning to steal medical supplies earmarked for hurricane relief in Florida. If I can record them discussing it, the FBI says they can make arrests and seize the diverted supplies before they disappear." The FBI operation was set for the following week, but news of the investigation leaked somehow. On Monday morning, Thomas arrived at work to find his office cleaned out and his access badges deactivated. His supervisor claimed that his position had been eliminated due to budget constraints, but the timing was obviously retaliatory. More troubling, Harrison and several other unit officials suddenly took extended leave, citing family emergencies and medical issues. Key documents began disappearing from files, and several employees reported that they had been ordered to delete emails and destroy records related to contractor relationships. "They're destroying evidence and fleeing," Amanda told Sarah. "The FBI needs to move fast before the whole conspiracy evaporates." But the corruption investigation had taken on a life of its own. Other agencies began reviewing their own contractor relationships with the Meridian Group subsidiaries. State emergency officials who had worked with the company started asking uncomfortable questions about supply discrepancies they had previously ignored. Insurance companies that had paid claims for disaster response began demanding audits of services they had funded. The media attention also prompted other whistleblowers to come forward. A former FEMA coordinator revealed similar patterns of supply theft during West Coast wildfire responses. A Red Cross logistics manager documented instances where donated supplies had been diverted to unauthorized locations. A state emergency director provided evidence that hurricane response in the Southeast had been compromised by contractor fraud. What had started as Sarah's lonely fight against corruption in her own unit was becoming a nationwide reckoning with systematic fraud throughout the emergency response system. The personal toll on Sarah was severe. The stress of constant surveillance and threats was exhausting, and the character attacks in the media were painful despite her family's support. She had trouble sleeping, lost weight, and found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. But she also felt a sense of vindication that sustained her through the difficult moments. Every new piece of evidence that emerged, every additional whistleblower who came forward, every investigation that was launched, proved that her concerns had been legitimate and urgent. More importantly, she could see that change was happening.
New oversight procedures were being implemented. Questionable contracts were being reviewed, and the culture of willful blindness that had allowed the corruption to flourish was being challenged. The congressional hearing was moved up due to public pressure and media attention. Sarah would testify before a packed committee room with national television coverage, finally having the chance to tell her story without filter or interpretation. As she prepared her testimony, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months earlier, she had been a respected career civil servant, focused on doing her job and helping disaster victims. Now she was a public figure at the center of a national scandal, her life forever changed by her decision to speak out against corruption. She didn't regret the choice, but she understood that there was no going back to the quiet anonymity she had once enjoyed. Win or lose, she would forever be known as the whistleblower who exposed the disaster relief fraud. Her career in emergency management was over, but her fight for justice was just beginning. The night before the hearing, Emma called to wish her luck. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Mom, you've already won. You've shown that one person can make a difference, that regular people don't have to accept corruption just because it's committed by powerful institutions." Sarah looked at the testimony she had prepared, at the boxes of evidence that supported every allegation, at the list of witnesses who were ready to corroborate her claims. Tomorrow she would have her day in court, metaphorically speaking. Tomorrow the country would hear the truth about what had been done in their name with their tax dollars. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished. She had kept faith with the disaster victims who counted on emergency responders to be there in their darkest hours. She had honored the public trust that had been placed in her when she took her oath of office 15 years earlier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attacks, and new revelations about the scope of the corruption she had exposed. But tonight, Sarah Martinez knew that she had chosen correctly when she decided to fight rather than stay silent. The storm she had unleashed was far from over, but she was no longer facing it alone. The committee hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Camera crews lined the walls, reporters filled every available seat, and the gallery was crowded with emergency responders, disaster survivors, and government accountability advocates who had traveled from across the country to witness Sarah's testimony. Sarah sat at the witness table, flanked by her attorney and Amanda Price, who would testify about her investigation. Across from them sat a phalanx of lawyers representing the Crisis Response Unit, Meridian Group, and various government officials who had been implicated in the corruption scandal. Committee Chair Senator Patricia Williams gavelled the hearing to order and delivered opening remarks that set the tone for what was to come. "We are here today to examine serious allegations of systematic fraud within our federal disaster response system. If these allegations prove true, they represent not just a betrayal of public trust, but a callous disregard for the lives of Americans who depend on emergency services during their most vulnerable moments." Senator Williams had built her career on government accountability issues, and she was clearly prepared to conduct a thorough and aggressive investigation. She had been briefed extensively on the evidence that Sarah and other whistleblowers had provided, and her questions would be precise and well-informed. Sarah's testimony began with a chronological account of her career and the gradual realization that something was seriously wrong within her unit. She spoke calmly and methodically, presenting evidence and explaining the significance of each document and pattern she had discovered. "I want to be clear about my motivations," Sarah said, looking directly at the committee members. "I didn't come forward because I was angry about being fired. I came forward because I saw people suffering while others profited from their misery. I saw emergency supplies being diverted from disaster zones to private warehouses. I saw medical equipment sitting in storage facilities while hospitals in flood zones ran out of critical resources." She held up a photograph that had become symbolic of the entire scandal. Trucks loaded with emergency supplies sitting in a Pinnacle Logistics warehouse while news footage played on monitors behind her showing hurricane victims standing in line for hours waiting for relief supplies that never arrived. This photograph was taken during Hurricane Patricia response. Those trucks contained medical supplies, water purification tablets, and emergency generators that were supposed to be delivered to evacuation centers in Texas. Instead, they sat in this warehouse for 3 weeks while the contractor submitted invoices claiming successful delivery. The impact of the visual evidence was immediate and powerful. Committee members leaned forward to study the photographs and documents Sarah presented. Several looked visibly angry as they realized the scope of the fraud and its human consequences. The questioning began with friendly inquiries from committee Democrats who supported Sarah's decision to come forward. They walked her through the timeline of events, the evidence she had gathered, and the retaliation she faced for raising concerns. But the real drama came when Republican committee members, clearly coached by defense lawyers, attempted to undermine Sarah's credibility and characterize the corruption as isolated incidents or bureaucratic mistakes rather than systematic fraud. Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that you were terminated for performance issues that predated any allegations of fraud? Asked Congressman Robert Hayes, reading from prepared notes. Sarah was ready for the attack.
Congressman, my performance evaluations were exemplary for 14 and a half years. The only performance issues cited in my termination were my refusal to approve fraudulent invoices and my insistence on investigating supply discrepancies. If doing my job properly constitutes a performance problem, then I suppose I was indeed performing poorly. But you acknowledge that you violated established procedures by accessing files outside your direct area of responsibility. I accessed files that were necessary to track emergency supplies from procurement to delivery, which was explicitly part of my job responsibilities as operations coordinator.
The only way those files could be considered outside my area of responsibility is if someone wanted to hide what was in them. The exchange continued for an hour, with Hayes and other Republican members attempting to paint Sarah as a rogue employee who had overstepped her authority and misinterpreted routine bureaucratic processes. But Sarah had anticipated every line of attack and was prepared with specific evidence that contradicted each attempt at misdirection. The turning point came when Senator Williams asked Sarah to explain what had happened to the dialysis machines that were supposed to be delivered during Hurricane Patricia. Sarah's voice was steady but emotional, as she recounted Dr. Morgan's testimony about the kidney patients who had been put at risk because life-saving equipment was diverted for profit.
Senator, we're not talking about paperwork errors or bureaucratic inefficiencies. We're talking about people who died because medical equipment was stolen.
One of those patients was a 73-year-old retired teacher named Margaret Thompson. She died during the helicopter evacuation to Dallas because the dialysis machine that was supposed to be at the evacuation center was sitting in an Oklahoma warehouse so someone could submit a false invoice and collect payment for services never rendered.
The room was silent as Sarah continued. Margaret Thompson survived Hurricane Patricia. She survived the flooding of her home and the evacuation of her neighborhood. She died because emergency responders failed her, because people who were supposed to be protecting her were instead robbing her.
The emotional power of the testimony was devastating. Several committee members were visibly moved, and even some of the defense lawyers appeared uncomfortable with what they were hearing.
Amanda Price's testimony followed, providing the broader context that connected Sarah's allegations to patterns of fraud throughout the emergency response system. She presented evidence showing that Meridian Group and its subsidiaries had systematically defrauded multiple agencies, diverted supplies from dozens of disasters, and compromised response efforts that had put thousands of lives at risk.
This wasn't a case of isolated corruption or a few bad actors, Amanda explained. This was a comprehensive criminal enterprise that treated natural disasters as business opportunities and disaster victims as acceptable casualties in their pursuit of profit. The most damaging testimony came from Thomas Chen, the Pinnacle Logistics whistleblower who had provided internal documents showing how the fraud was organized and executed.
Despite losing his job and facing legal threats, Thomas had agreed to testify about what he had witnessed from inside the contractor network. We had spreadsheets tracking which supplies to divert from which disasters, Thomas testified. We had quotas for how much equipment we needed to steal to meet profit targets. We had procedures for falsifying delivery confirmations and creating fake documentation to cover our tracks.
Thomas presented internal Meridian Group emails discussing which disasters offered the best opportunities for fraud, which government officials were most likely to approve questionable invoices, and which oversight procedures could be circumvented most easily. One email exchange was particularly damning.
In it, a Meridian Group executive expressed concern about the humanitarian impact of their supply diversions, only to be told by his supervisor, "Our job is to maximize shareholder value, not to save lives."
The government's job is to save lives. Our job is to bill them for it.
The callousness of the statement shocked even the defense lawyers, several of whom were seen shaking their heads in disgust. But the most powerful moment of the hearing came when Dr. Elizabeth Morgan took the witness table. As the former chief medical officer for the Crisis Response Unit, she had credibility that transcended political considerations. Her testimony about the medical consequences of the fraud was clinical, precise, and devastating. I documented 17 cases where medical emergencies were prolonged or worsened because supplies were diverted or delayed, Dr. Morgan testified. In 6 of those cases, patients died as a direct result. In 11 cases, patients suffered permanent disabilities or complications that could have been prevented if proper equipment had been available. Dr. HMBC Morgan presented case studies of specific patients whose treatment had been compromised, always protecting their privacy but providing enough detail to illustrate the human cost of the corruption. Her testimony was methodical and professional, but the emotion was unmistakable. "I became a doctor to save lives," she concluded. "I joined the crisis response unit because I wanted to help people during their most vulnerable moments. When I realized that our own system was causing preventable deaths for the sake of contractor profits, I could no longer be part of it." The defense attempted to cross-examine the witnesses, but their strategies backfired spectacularly. Efforts to characterize the fraud as normal business practices only highlighted the callousness of the defendants. Attempts to blame lower-level employees for carrying out orders only emphasized the systematic nature of the corruption. Most damaging was the cross-examination of Sarah, where defense attorney Robert Morrison attempted to portray her as an unstable employee seeking revenge for professional disappointments. "Martinez, isn't it true that you had been passed over for promotion 3 times in the 2 years before your termination?" Sarah looked Morrison directly in the eye.
Mr. Morrison, I was passed over for promotions because I refused to participate in fraud.
"Each time I was considered for advancement, I was told that the position required someone who was more flexible about procurement procedures and team-oriented in their approach to contractor relationships. I now understand that those were euphemisms for someone who would be willing to look the other way while people stole emergency supplies." "That's speculation, Ms. Martinez. Well, you have no evidence that your promotion denials were connected to any alleged fraud." Sarah pulled out a document and handed it to the committee chair. "Actually, Mr. Broussard, Morrison, I do have evidence. This is an email from Director Harrison to Deputy Director Chen discussing my candidacy for the Assistant Operations Director position. In it, Harrison states that I am technically qualified but problematic in terms of contractor relations, and that my inflexibility regarding procurement procedures makes me unsuitable for advancement." Senator Williams read the email aloud, and its contents made clear that Sarah had indeed been penalized professionally for refusing to participate in corruption. The hearing continued for 3 days, with dozens of witnesses providing evidence of systematic fraud, cover-ups, and retaliation against whistleblowers. By the time testimony concluded, the scope and audacity of the corruption was undeniable. But Sarah knew that congressional hearings were just the beginning of the accountability process. The real test would be whether criminal prosecutions would follow, and whether systemic changes would be implemented to prevent similar corruption in the future. The FBI investigation, which had been proceeding parallel to the congressional inquiry, began bearing fruit within weeks of the hearing. Federal prosecutors announced a sweeping criminal case against Meridian Group executives, government officials who had facilitated the fraud, and intermediaries who had helped launder the stolen funds. Harrison and 3 other Crisis Response Unit officials were arrested on federal fraud charges. Meridian Group executives faced RICO charges for operating a criminal enterprise. Bank executives who had helped hide the fraudulent transactions were charged with money laundering. The indictments revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, which extended far beyond what even Sarah had suspected. The fraud network had included officials in 6 federal agencies, executives from dozens of contracting companies, and financial institutions that had helped disguise the movement of stolen funds. But for Sarah, the most satisfying moment came when the FBI announced the recovery of millions of dollars worth of emergency supplies that had been stolen from disaster zones over the past 5 years. Warehouses full of medical equipment, generators, water purification systems, and temporary housing materials were returned to government stockpiles for future emergency responses.
These supplies represent hope for future disaster victims, Sarah told reporters gathered outside the courthouse after the first arrests were announced. Every piece of equipment recovered is equipment that will be available to save lives instead of generating profits for criminals. The personal vindication was important, but Sarah was more focused on the systematic changes that were being implemented throughout the emergency response system.
New oversight procedures were put in place to track supplies from procurement to delivery. Independent auditing requirements were established for all disaster response contracts. Whistleblower protections were strengthened to prevent the kind of retaliation Sarah and others had faced. Perhaps most importantly, a new culture of accountability was emerging within the emergency management community. The scandal had shown that corruption wasn't just about money. It was literally a matter of life and death for disaster victims. The trials of the conspirators provided additional revelations about the scope of the fraud.
Internal Meridian Group documents revealed that the company had viewed natural disasters as profit opportunities and had actually celebrated major storms and earthquakes as chances to increase revenue through supply theft and invoice fraud. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a PowerPoint presentation found on Harrison's computer, titled Maximizing Revenue During Crisis Response.
The presentation included strategies for diverting supplies, techniques for inflating invoices, and methods for intimidating employees who asked uncomfortable questions. The presentation concluded with a slide that read, "Remember, disasters are temporary but profits are permanent." The callousness of the statement became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the corruption network. During Harrison's trial, prosecutors displayed the slide on screens throughout the courtroom as they detailed how his leadership had transformed a life-saving organization into a criminal enterprise. Harrison was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Other defendants received sentences ranging from 18 months to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with authorities.
But for Sarah, the most meaningful outcome was the impact on future disaster response. New procedures and oversight mechanisms were working. Supply tracking systems were preventing diversions. Contractor relationships were being scrutinized and audited.
Most importantly, the culture of silence and willful blindness that had allowed the corruption to flourish was being replaced by a culture of accountability and transparency. 2 years after her termination, Sarah was offered her old job back with full reinstatement of benefits and back pay.
The new director of the Crisis Response Unit, Dr. Maria Santos, had been brought in to clean house and restore the organization's integrity.
"We need people like you," Dr. Santos told Sarah during their meeting.
People who put mission before politics, who care more about saving lives than advancing careers. Sarah appreciated the offer, but she declined. Her experience had shown her that the real work of reform needed to happen from the outside through journalism, advocacy, and public accountability efforts.
Instead, she accepted a position with the Government Accountability Institute, a nonprofit organization focused on exposing corruption and strengthening oversight of federal agencies. Her job would be to help other whistleblowers navigate the complex process of reporting fraud and to work with journalists and prosecutors to ensure that evidence of corruption was properly investigated and prosecuted.
I learned that speaking truth to power isn't a one-time event, Sarah explained to Emma during a visit to her college campus. It's an ongoing commitment to transparency and accountability.
There will always be people who try to abuse public trust for personal gain, which means there always need to be people willing to expose them. Emma had changed her major from journalism to public policy, inspired by her mother's example, and determined to work on systematic reforms that would prevent future corruption.
"You didn't just expose fraud, Mom," Emma said. "You showed that individual conscience still matters, that regular people can take on powerful institutions and win." The ripple effects of Sarah's decision to speak out continued to spread. Other government employees came forward with evidence of corruption in their agencies, knowing that there were now procedures in place to protect whistleblowers and investigate their allegations seriously. Contractors throughout the emergency response system cleaned up their operations, knowing that supplies were now tracked carefully and that fraudulent invoices would be detected quickly.
Most importantly, disaster victims began receiving the full benefit of the resources that Congress had appropriated for their relief. Supplies arrived when and where they were supposed to. Medical equipment was available when emergencies struck. Response times improved dramatically once the artificial delays created by contractor fraud were eliminated. 3 years after her testimony, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference of emergency management professionals. Her speech focused not on the corruption she had exposed, but on the positive changes that had resulted from the reforms that followed. "We proved that accountability works," she told the audience of emergency responders. "We proved that transparency makes us stronger, not weaker.
And most importantly, we proved that the people we serve deserve better than a system that treats their suffering as a business opportunity." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Sarah personally. It was for the principle that public service means exactly that, serving the public, not serving private interests at public expense. As Sarah looked out at the audience of emergency responders, she saw people who had recommitted themselves to the mission of helping others in their darkest moments.
The corruption had been exposed, the criminals had been prosecuted, and the system had been reformed. But more than that, the scandal had reminded everyone in the emergency management community why their work mattered and what was at stake when they failed to live up to their responsibilities.
Margaret Thompson, the dialysis patient who had died during Hurricane Patricia, had become a symbol of the human cost of corruption. Her photograph was displayed in emergency operations centers around the country, along with a simple message: never again. That commitment to never again was Sarah's true victory.
Not the vindication of her reputation, not the prosecution of those who had retaliated against her, but the knowledge that future disaster victims would receive the help they needed because she had chosen to speak out when it mattered most. The team that had expelled her from their ranks had indeed crumbled, just as the title of her story suggested, but from that collapse had emerged something stronger. A system that actually worked, professionals who took their obligations seriously, and a culture that valued integrity over convenience.
Sarah Martinez had lost a job but saved a system. She had endured personal attacks but protected public trust. She had been expelled from a corrupt team but had helped create an honest one.
They expelled her from the team. Then the unit began to crumble.